So this story is absolutely horrific. So if you guys are sensitive to crimes against children and cult-like circumstances, then this is your fair warning. Consider this your trigger warning. This video is probably not for you, so I would suggest to click out and just join me on the next video. Now, from the moment that I learned about this case, I absolutely knew I had to do a video on this, not just because of how obscene and unique this entire story was, but because I also think it's important to highlight a lot of the red flags that often get missed by people that, you might have friends, you might have relatives, and you might see some things that are a little bit off, but you never truly know what's going on in someone's home. So I think it's important to highlight these little flags. They are oftentimes things that could be missed or simply brushed off, but you never know. Sometimes calling out people or looking at these things a little bit closer could very much save somebody's life. So today we are going to talk about Eddie Sexton and how he essentially ran and turned his family into a deranged cult. All right, guys, let's get into the story. Now, quickly before we get into today's video, let me introduce myself quickly here. My name is Ashley and I like to talk about crime, creepy, and unbelievable stories. I post on here once a week, usually on Fridays, but I also have a TikTok where I post a lot more content on there. I post short story format. I post multiple times a day, sometimes 2-3 times a day. So if that's something that interests you guys, go ahead and check it out. The link is in my description box below. Also, if you guys wouldn't mind, I would truly appreciate any support you guys could give on this channel. Comment, like, subscribe. It all really does help. All right, so enough rambling. Let's get into the story of Eddie Sexton. So Eddie Lee Sexton was born on May 12, 1942 in West Virginia. By all accounts, he was born into a coal mining family and he showed signs of being a troubled youth very early on. Now, he was the youngest child of 10 children, which I'm sure didn't help the entire situation. Now, I'm sure if you guys are from larger families, or even if you have friends and family that have this sort of situation at home, the youngest children, for the most part, tend to get the least amount of discipline from the household. Paired with the fact that Eddie's father passed away in 1952 when Eddie was just 10 years old, I'm sure all of these factors did not help. With a single parent family household trying to raise 10 children, this simply could not have been easy by any means whatsoever. Throughout his teenage years, Eddie did get into trouble with law enforcement, and although the details are hard to come by, we do know that Eddie spent some time in a juvenile facility. When he was 21 years old, he disturbingly got his 15-year-old girlfriend pregnant. Now, I know this was a different time, it was a different era, but even then, I still feel like 21 years old is too old to be doing anything with a 15-year-old. It's extremely inappropriate in my opinion, but let me know what you guys think. So this situation of theirs obviously resulted in the young girl getting pregnant, which forced both of them to get married, which they did. But right after their wedding day, Eddie was caught in an armed robbery of a local gas station. Not necessarily how anyone thinks that they're going to spend their honeymoon. In 1963, Eddie was then sentenced to serve 4.5 years in prison for that robbery, and as you can imagine, his wife was not happy about this, and this led to them getting divorced shortly after she gave birth to their son named Patrick. After his release, he ended up meeting another woman named Estella, who would go on to become his second wife. Together, they had 12 children, which is an absolutely insane number to me. In total, they ended up having 7 boys and 5 girls. And eventually, the family settled down in a small town known as Jackson Township, Ohio, near Cleveland. Now, to make this story a little bit easier to follow, we're going to focus on a few of the children in particular. Those are Pixie, Charles, Willie, Sherry, But just to make it clear, that does not take away from all of the horrific things all of these children had to go through. So by today's statistics, Jackson Township only has a population of 40,000 people. So you can imagine that it must have been a lot less back then in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's also known to be a very family-oriented destination. You know, the suburb life is king here, and most people tend to have very conservative values. So you can imagine when a secret like this was exposed in an area like this, it must have been absolutely dreadful and really hard for people to believe, let alone accept. So when it comes to Eddie Sexton, unfortunately, there were many red flags popping up. In the 1970s, of all things, he decided to become an ordained minister. I guess this was his way of trying to hide things or divert attention from what he was actually doing. According to one of his sons named Charles, a large amount of people in the community would come to Eddie in order to have their weddings officiated by him. And most of these weddings took place in his front yard, and for the most part, the children were often witnesses to these private ceremonies. We would also later find out that Eddie used his preaching and doctrine to manipulate and abuse his children, since most of his teachings would end up focusing on apocalyptic predictions and abuse of other sorts. But this was far from it. His preachings would also go on to intensify and blend many different beliefs that kind of ended up creating his own religion, aka his own cult. Surprisingly though, many people who knew Eddie spoke of him very highly, especially as a first impression. Many people said that he was quite charming, he had a lot of charisma, and many people just took to him right away. It wasn't until you really got to know him that you would get to know who he actually was. And for the most part, people would label him as a con man, or more appropriately, as a devil in disguise. As an example, one of the activities that got him the label as a con man was when he would fake a back injury of his, which he supposedly sustained in order to claim disability benefits while working under the table as a handyman. So the abuse in the Sexton household was almost immediate. I guess it would be fair to say that a lot of these children barely had a chance. When the children were younger, they would have these awful nightmares and they would see things in the dark, just as most children their age would. However, Eddie would take that opportunity to manipulate them. He would tell them that anytime they would hear strange noises or they would see shadows or see things in the dark, it was essentially the devil trying to get into the family home and take the lives or souls of the children. He would then tell them that the only way they would remain safe was if they were to listen to exactly what their father would tell them to do. And if they would ever disobey him, then the devil would come down from the sky and essentially take them away to hell. As Charles was getting older, he started to notice things about his father that just were not adding up. For example, since his father was an ordained minister, he started to notice that the family was not going to church on Sundays, and none of the kids went to Sunday school like the rest of the people in the community who were going to church. Instead, though, Eddie Sexton took this opportunity to create his own version of the church and thus his own religion. At the beginning, the family would go to these gatherings that would take place outside, where Eddie would stand in the middle and the entire family would circle around him. That's where he would proceed to destroy various religious symbols in front of everyone, warning them that God would no longer be there for them. According to Eddie Sexton himself, he was the only God the family needed, and that they all now needed to worship him and him alone. But that was just the beginning. From a very young age as well, the kids were often neglected and left on their own for extended periods of time. The kids were sometimes tied up to their beds and left alone for very long periods of time in the dark as a form of punishment, which would end up forcing the children to soil themselves and kind of were left to sit there in their own filth for God knows how long. And essentially, their bedrooms were basically empty rooms with the bed, and they also rarely had electricity or additional furniture. To further brainwash his children and his wife, Eddie would hold these very strange seances that involved animal sacrifice. This would also include drinking the blood of the animals from a chalice. During these seances, he would walk into this room and put on a black cloak, and he would end up drawing this pentagram on the dining room table. And he also read from this book that he called a Bible while the entire family circled around him and held hands. He would also make the children believe that he had supernatural powers, often pretending, or who knows, maybe he actually did believe that he had these powers, but he would tell everyone around him that he had the power to summon and communicate with spirits. Each of the children were also forced to sign contracts in their own blood, stating that they would be banished to hell if they did not obey their father. Pair this with the preachings about the end of the world, a little bit of Satanism in there, and the children were essentially forced and brainwashed to believe absolutely anything their father said to them. What's more is that Eddie also made sure to instill fear into their children and made sure that they would never tell anyone about anything that was going on inside the family household. With the fear of punishment constantly inside the minds of everyone in the family, everyone essentially obeyed Eddie Sexton absolutely blindly. As the children reached school age, their father tried to keep them as isolated as possible. It was said that the children were only allowed to have one friend each, and they were prohibited from really speaking to anyone outside of school. On top of that, they were never allowed to go to their one friend's home for whatever reason, and vice versa, no one was allowed to come to their house either. There was one incident where he was getting a little bit worried and paranoid that one of his daughters was going to end up talking to someone at school about all of the crazy things that were going on at home. He had specifically instructed her before letting her go to school that she was not allowed to talk to anyone outside of her classroom. If she needed to talk to her teacher, it needed to be in the classroom in front of all of the other students. But to make sure that this was not going to go awry, he instructed all of his sons who were going to the same school as his daughter and instructed all of them to keep an eye on her. He then said that they were to make sure that she did not speak to anyone outside of the classroom, and that if any of them did see her talking to anyone at all, then they were ordered to call him right away. And to make sure that they would call him if this were the case, he gave them all a quarter so they could use a payphone and make the call immediately. Later that day at school, his daughter Sherry was spotted talking to a teacher in the hallway at school by her brother Charles. Immediately, he did as he was told out of fear, and he went to a phone booth and called his father right away. When Sherry arrived home from school that day, unfortunately, she had the beating of a lifetime waiting for her at the house. All the children, including Charles, remember Sherry crying and essentially begging for her father to stop, and that she was sorry that she talked to the teacher and that all she was doing was asking for help about homework. And she was essentially begging for mercy, but her father just did not stop until finally silence just basically echoed throughout the entire house. Seeing something so traumatic obviously scars you, and it scares you quite a bit. It makes you not want to disobey out of fear because you are seeing what happens to someone when you disobey. And the last thing you want is for the same thing to happen to you, which is, it's sad to say, but understandably, this is essentially why all of the kids did what they were being told to do. Their survival instinct kicked in and they all just stayed quiet. In an interview Charles gave later on, to this day, he feels immense guilt for calling his father that day. And he explains that he only did it out of fear, and that if he would be able to redo it all over again, obviously he would not call his father. But of course, the abuse did not end there. There was much, much more, and a lot of the details are hard to come by. But there are snippets of information that we do get access to. And for example, Eddie would apparently threaten to take the life of the children's mother in front of them just for fun or to just instill even more fear into all of them. And he would also humiliate his sons by making them undress and essentially stand in the hallway while he beat them and the rest of the children watched. Later on, as the children got a little bit older, the SA kind of abuse began at the hands of their evil father. The abuse was said to have been so rampant and aggressive that the children then started abusing each other in the same way, which created a very twisted, disgusting, incestual-filled home. Charles suffered greatly from this abuse as well. Even though he was a male, his father did not discriminate. In the same interview, Charles also said that his father would order him to perform all sorts of inappropriate acts on his father, and all he could really do was pray for it to be over soon. Sherry would also come out later on and said that her father had a very inappropriate relationship with her when she was just 13 up until she was 19. But she was not the only one. Eddie Sexton also had eyes for one of his other daughters named Pixie. There was one incident where Charles and his younger brother Willie were in the family home. They had decided to go down to the basement, and that's where they witnessed something absolutely horrific. They witnessed their father and their sister Pixie engaging in inappropriate, disgusting behavior together. Both of the boys ran upstairs only to be followed by their father and Pixie pretending like everything was absolutely fine because this was now their new normal. Eddie was said to have been absolutely obsessed with Pixie. One evening, she was said to have come downstairs into the living room and she was wearing a white veil. She was then followed by her father, who announced to the entire family that he was going to marry his 17-year-old daughter, Pixie. And so he ended up performing the ceremony in the middle of the living room with his entire family watching, including his wife. According to Charles, Pixie was actually happy about this, and I guess this is a testament as to how brainwashed she had been at this point, because to her, she was actually in love with her father. This was probably one of the happiest days of her life. But one daughter was not enough for Eddie Sexton. It's said that he also went on to perform 2 additional wedding ceremonies with 2 of his other daughters inside the family home. Now, what comes next is absolutely disgusting, if that's even possible at this point. But this wedding ceremony led to Pixie becoming pregnant with her father's children. 2 young daughters would end up being born that were named Dawn and Shasta, who were just separated by 1 year. Knowing that this was abhorrently wrong, this pushed Eddie to lie to the rest of the family, because I guess that's where he kind of drew the line of morality. Sleeping with your daughter was one thing, but having children with her, I guess to him was another thing that he just didn't want to fully admit to. So he told everyone that Pixie had gotten pregnant by some guy that was enlisted in the army. But in hindsight, everyone already knew the truth. Now at this point, neighbors were also kind of getting a little weirded out. Although the kids didn't really socialize with anyone, they weren't really allowed outside. Whenever they would go outside, neighbors started to notice that Pixie was pregnant. And they were getting concerned because she was still in high school at the time. They knew that she didn't have a boyfriend. They knew that the kids were not really sociable kids. So it didn't really make sense, or they couldn't fully understand how this girl, who's usually isolated, could get pregnant not once, but twice. So in order to hide the disgusting truth, Eddie came up with a very devious plan in order to hide what he had done. Eddie Sexton then ordered his daughter Pixie to go find a boyfriend at school in order to create a believable storyline that she had gotten pregnant with a boy from school. Now keep in mind, at this point, this is the 3rd time she's gotten pregnant, so he definitely needed some sort of story to cover up what was going on. And surprisingly, this ended up working. Pixie introduced her family to her new boyfriend, who was named Joel Good, whom she had met at school. He was described as being a very nice boy who happened to be overly trusting and a little bit slow-witted. Eddie Sexton played nice and pretended that they all had a very loving, close-knit family as they welcomed Joel into the family, and it ended up working. Although it was said that Joel's family was extremely worried about him engaging in a relationship with a young girl who has already been pregnant by another man, and she's only 17 years old. They did share their worries with him, but Joel didn't listen. He really was obsessed with Pixie. He was in love with her, and they went on to pursue their relationship together. Soon after that, Pixie and Joel wound up getting married in February of 1992, and they welcomed a baby together named Skipper Lee Good. But keep in mind, Joel was under the impression that this was his and Pixie's baby together. He had absolutely no idea that the actual father of this baby was Eddie Sexton. So as time passed, Eddie grew extremely paranoid that police were just going to show up at the house at any moment. So at this point, he started preparing his family for war. He began training them on how to fight, how to take a life, how to cut, and so on and so forth. And now at this point, many of the boys in the family were so brainwashed to protect their family at all costs that they would have really done absolutely anything their father ordered them to do. So in April of 1992, another daughter of Eddie Sexton's named Michelle ended up exposing her father's secrets. She had been brave enough to talk to someone at social services that was at the school about how her parents had been abusing her and the rest of her siblings, which then led to an investigation by police. By this point, it was said that there were only 6 children living at the home, which most of were minors. The rest had reached adulthood and had gone off on their own, except for Pixie and Joel. When police and social services arrived to the family home, surprisingly, many of the kids reiterated what Michelle had said. This resulted in 3 of the younger children being taken from the family home and placed in the custody of Ohio's Department of Human Services. But in a shocking turn of events, those children were then brought back to the family home due to lack of evidence. Just a few months later, in November of 1992, police were again investigating the Sexton family household, but this time they were going to remove all of the children. However, Eddie Sexton was not going to let that happen, at least not without a fight. He then proceeded to barricade himself and the entire family inside the home, using multiple weapons to protect themselves. Eddie had his sons board up all of the windows and all of the doors in the home before calling the police himself, threatening to take the lives of his family members if the police tried to do anything. When police arrived, it was said to have been like a scene out of Hollywood. The entire street had been evacuated. There were patrol units set up absolutely everywhere. And Eddie proceeded to announce to the police that for every shot they fired, he would take a life of one of his family members. On the inside, though, Eddie was instructing his sons to guard the house and to shoot at any officers if they were to come too close to the house. Now, this standoff lasted 2 entire days. It was very tense. It was very hostile, but police were able to convince Eddie to turn himself in. Shockingly, though, he was later released on bond, and of course, he took this opportunity to run away with his entire family, including Joel. According to Charles, he said that his father told him and the rest of the family that they had to get ready for war, and that absolutely nobody was going to take his family away from him. So at this point, the family, which was now made up of Eddie, Estelle, Willie, Charles, Sherry, Joel, Pixie, and her 3 children, all moved across several states, including Oklahoma, then Indiana, and then finally Florida, specifically in a state park. And this is where the family would set up camp at a local campsite, and they would hide in the woods. Once they were settled into their little campsite at Little Manatee River State Park, Eddie wasted no time in training his children with military-type drills in case police ever showed up again. The kids were also said to have started drinking and inhaling toxic fumes quite heavily at this point. Then in October of 1993, little baby Skipper had fallen quite ill. Not wanting to expose his deepest, darkest secrets of his family's whereabouts either, Eddie refused to take Skipper to the hospital. And sadly, because the baby was in so much pain, he was said to have been crying continuously, and it was quite loud. This pushed Eddie to absolutely lose his patience, and he was getting very worried that someone would hear them. So then he ordered Pixie to quiet the baby, or else he would take care of it himself. Pixie then covered the baby's mouth, and now this part is heavily debated. We don't fully know if she just intended to quiet the baby or if she actually had malicious intentions behind this. But whatever the case, she ended up taking that little baby's life. Baby Skipper sadly suffocated in her arms and was then buried in a very shallow grave in the forest. He was said to have been buried in a blanket, then placed in a gym bag, and then garbage bags in an attempt to conceal the smell as much as possible, which is an absolutely brutal end to such a short and innocent life. Joel, on the other hand, was not present for those events. I'm sure if he had been there, he wouldn't have let that happen. But when he did return to the campsite, he was obviously absolutely distraught at the thought of losing what he thought was his firstborn son. Pixie ended up lying to him and told him that Skipper had passed away due to SIDS, which is sudden infant death syndrome. Now, if you don't know what SIDS is, essentially it's an unexplained passing of a child under the age of 1. For the most part, it occurs when the baby is sleeping, and there is rarely any sign of a struggle when it happens. Unfortunately, there is no direct known cause for SIDS, but it could be a combination of multiple stressors like their environment, sleep positions, breathing difficulties, and so on and so forth. At this point, Joel was forced to face the truth of the kind of family he had married into, and that's when he really started to question absolutely everything. It was also here when Pixie had decided to tell him the truth about who the real father of her 2 other daughters were. Now, this really finally pushed Joel over the edge and really forced him to believe that baby Skipper had not passed away due to SIDS. He really wanted to find out the truth for himself. On November 30th, 1993, Joel took Pixie to the closest library in the area, which happened to be at Tampa University. That's where he started searching for books on SIDS. Eddie obviously ended up finding out about this, and he wasted no time in following the pair to the library, where apparently there was a very big altercation that was witnessed by the librarian known as Gail Novak. She apparently reported the incident to campus security, but they brushed it off as a prank. So in an attempt to calm things down a bit, especially since Joel was still in the belief that baby Skipper was his son and not Eddie's, although I'm not entirely sure why he didn't kind of click into that at that point, Eddie told him that he would fix the situation by replacing baby Skipper with another baby. And I'm sure a lot of you have ideas about what his genius plan was. Now, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, but his great idea was to literally steal a baby. But not just any baby. His genius plan was to drive to Ohio, where one of his oldest sons, Eddie Jr., was living. Eddie Jr. had left the family home, he had gotten married, and now had kids. So Eddie Sexton's plan was literally to steal his son's newborn baby. And so with that, him and Charles drove to Ohio, where Eddie instructed Charles to get rid of Eddie Jr.'s wife when she answered the door, to then walk into the home, take the baby, and then they would drive off. And surprisingly, because Charles was so brainwashed at this point, he said that whatever his father told him to do, he would just do it. So he exits the car when they got to the house, knocks on the door, and thankfully no one answered the door, because he said that if someone would have answered it, he would have done exactly what he had been told to do. And so with their genius plan now a bust, the 2 men were then forced to return back to Florida empty-handed. Now at this point, Joel was absolutely adamant that he wanted to go back to Ohio, but Eddie was not going to let that happen. And according to reports, we would later find out that Eddie told Joel that the only way he was going to go back to Ohio was as a corpse. Needless to say, Eddie was now on high alert. He was extremely paranoid that Joel was going to reveal the family secret, that he was going to reveal their location. And so immediately he started concocting another genius plan to make sure that that wouldn't happen. So at this point, he starts talking to his other son, Willie, and he starts training him on how to use a garrote. Now, if you don't know what that is, it's a string or a rope attached to two ends with handles used to strangle someone. Now, unfortunately, the reason Eddie ended up picking Willie for this particular task was because Willie was known to suffer from mental health issues, and he was classified as being slower than average, which made him a lot easier to manipulate. Now, this part is a little bit sketchy because we don't know the exact date it happened, but sometime between American Thanksgiving and Christmas of 1993, Willie, under the orders of his father, took Joel for a walk into the woods and then ambushed him with the garrote and took his life. Sadly, his body was then buried close to Skipper's body. But there's more about this particular incident. According to Sherry, she had a slightly different version of the events that occurred that day. She claimed that Pixie had helped Willie do the deed, and that Pixie was apparently even happy that Joel was no longer in the picture. So 1994 comes around, and the FBI finally issues a national arrest warrant for Eddie and Estelle for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution, and so with that, the manhunt began for the Sexton family. It wasn't until January 14th, 1994 that the family was discovered and captured when Eddie had made a phone call to his brother who was living in Indiana but mistakenly charged the collect call to his previous number from Ohio. The FBI was then able to trace the call to a payphone coming from Little Manatee River Park. In addition to that, the FBI also knew that Eddie had stolen a gray 1993 Nissan Sentra from his brother-in-law since it had been reported as stolen for non-payment. And with that information, the police assumed that that must have been the car the family was using to get away. The FBI also passed on all of this information to the local police in Tampa, and that's when they started searching the remote areas. Once the FBI saw Eddie and Estelle leaving the campsite on car, they were pulled over and immediately arrested. And shortly after that, the FBI went to the campsite and rounded up the rest of the Sexton family. Of course, after everyone was rounded up and brought to the police station, they were all questioned and examined, which ended up revealing some very disturbing information. Both Shasta and Dawn, Pixie's daughters, had obvious signs of being SA'd, and Dawn would also tell investigators that those responsible were her uncle/brother, Willie. It was through the interview that Charles gave to police that they would find out what had truly happened to both Joel and Skipper, as well as the entire web of crimes the family had committed over the years. Needless to say, it was extremely overwhelming for everyone, and Charles was the one that ended up leading the authorities to both the bodies of Joel and baby Skipper. Thankfully, Eddie Sexton was arrested just in time because he was in the middle of making plans to take another innocent person's life, and that person was a man named Raymond Hesser. Raymond was living on the campsite as well, and Eddie's great idea was to essentially get rid of Raymond in order to assume his identity. In his plan, he also wanted to take Raymond's car and truck and camper and dispose of his body in the Manatee River, which thankfully he never got to do. On February 16th, 1994, Eddie Sexton was indicted on first-degree murder of Joel Good. Obviously, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. Pixie, although she was a victim, she was also held responsible for her actions and was given a 6-year sentence for her role in what happened to Skipper. Willie, although he was an adult at the time, he did have the mind of an 8-year-old. Many thought that he would be able to get away with what happened or that nothing would really happen to him. However, he was found guilty for taking Joel's life and therefore was sentenced to 25 years in prison. And as for Estelle, she was also given life in prison. But according to her son Charles, to this day, he believes that his mother was just as much as a victim as the rest of the children. He says that she did not abuse them, that she was actually abused by their father, and that she did the best she could to protect her children. Unfortunately, the justice system believed otherwise, and they charged her with aiding and abetting a criminal, child abuse, amongst other things, and therefore was given a life sentence. Several years after his sentence, Eddie passed away in prison due to natural causes and was followed by Estelle in October 2017, and she also passed away due to natural causes. As for the rest of the kids, we don't know a whole lot, which, I could kind of believe or assume was going to be the case. When you go through something so traumatic, the last thing you want to do is make yourself public or give interviews and tell people about what's been going on. I could only assume that all you want to do at that point is be private and focus on healing and growing and, kind of making up for all of the life you've lost. So I definitely understand why we don't know much about the rest of the surviving kids. As for Charles, he did attempt to take his own life, but thankfully it did not work. It was a failed attempt, which completely changed his mind about the situation. He took it as a sign that he needed to continue living. And thankfully he did. He went on to get married and now has a family of his own. And he does say that he could never see himself doing anything remotely close to what his father did to his own family. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Eddie Sexton and how he ran his family like a very disturbing cult. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you think the sentences were fair according to what Pixie did, to what Willie did, or even Estelle? I feel like there's going to be a lot of conflicting opinions on those sentences, but let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Now, if you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to comment, like, subscribe. It all really does help. And don't forget to check out my TikTok again. The link is in my description box below. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me on this video, and I will see you in the next one.